There's a distillery that was closed in the early 90s, only to reopen again in the early 2000s, 7 years later. And no, I am not talking about Bruichladdich. Let's talk about Bladnoch. Hey guys, welcome back to Whiskey on the West Coast. My name is Matt, and today we're going to be talking about a distillery that I actually don't have much experience with official bottlings from. I have more experience with independent bottlings, and even that is somewhat scarce. I'm talking about the Bladnoch distillery in the Lowlands. It's actually the southernmost distillery in Scotland, as far as I understand. And it's a coastal distillery about a kilometer away from the ocean. So it's situated in a really unique place. Now, Bladnoch has an interesting history of closures, of changes in ownership, and it was most recently, I believe, mothballed in 1993. Now, this is interesting because it reopened again 7 years later in the year 2000. However, that also sounds very familiar to me because I love Bruichladdich as a distillery, and my understanding is Bruichladdich, the last spirit off their stills pre-closure, came off the stills in 1994, and they were purchased in 2000, and they reopened, and the first spirit flowed back off those stills in 2001, again 7 years later. So really interesting comparison there, a parallel between those two, around the same time, same duration of closure. Really fascinating. When they were reopened, Bladnoch, talking about now, they were actually purchased a year later in 1994. So the change in ownership happened very quickly for Bladnoch, but they didn't reopen again until the year 2000, essentially. That's when they started producing spirit once again. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but one of the reasons was, I believe the original concept for what was going to happen to Bladnoch was the property was going to be turned into cabins or some sort of tourist real estate operation. It wasn't actually intended to have spirit made again. And one of the reasons why we know this is because the people who sold Bladnoch to its next owner, Raymond Armstrong, they had it written into the contract that Armstrong, while he inherited a lot of stocks of whiskey, he wasn't to actually produce any more whiskey. He was contractually obligated not to make more whiskey, which is a really strange business agreement to enter into. However, over time, they loosened on this. This did change, and Mr. Armstrong, I believe, started producing spirit anywhere from like 20,000 to 100,000 liters per year. Not exactly certain on the numbers, but it was a small amount of whiskey. Flash forward further into the future, and there was another change of ownership in 2015 when an Australian named David Pryor went ahead and purchased Bladnoch from Mr. Raymond Armstrong. Now, this is the current owners of Bladnoch, and it's an Australian operation essentially, but they have gone ahead and they did hire a former Macallan master distiller, Nick Savage, to help run the operations there. And there's some of the releases where you can see his influence on it, in particular some of their more sherried expressions. But it's really interesting to hear and see and learn a bit more about Bladnoch, because it's not a distillery that we've seen too much, because they've had such a history of closures, changes in ownership, and these sorts of things. So I'm really excited to dive into this distillery and dive into these drams I have in front of me here. Now, in this video, I'm going to be giving you first impressions on some whiskeys that I had in a Kensington Wine Market virtual tasting I was catching up on because I missed it a long time ago. But I'm really thankful to be able to get these sorts of things, and it means that I can taste so much more than I would be able to otherwise. So thank you to Kensington Wine Market for hosting these virtual tastings and posting the videos online so I can catch up on them. Now, what I'm having today and what I'm going to be talking to you about is three different whiskeys that are three different faces of Bladnoch, very different takes on Bladnoch and their style and type of whiskey. So the first one I'm going to talk about is a very, I'd say, more typical Bladnoch style. It's ex-bourbon cask. It's a Bladnoch 10-year-old from 2022, and that is a 46.7% expression. Again, ex-bourbon cask. So that one I'm going to start off with. I'm really excited to share what I have to say about that one. I'm also going to talk about the Bladnoch Talia rare release, which is a release that is both Oloroso sherry and California red wine cask, but it also has some very old stocks, some of the oldest stocks in Bladnoch's archives. And so that one is going to be really interesting to dive into and tell you how I think that compares to another old whiskey made with stocks from a prior time. And then we're going to talk about a really interesting thing, which is peated Bladnoch, Bladnoch Alinta. And that is a ex-sherry, ex-bourbon cask, but it is peated Bladnoch. And I believe that that whiskey, all of it, if not most of it, comes from basically the new ownership regime. So that would be distilled since 2015. So it's young, peated Bladnoch. Really interesting to hear about. Before we keep going, I just want to make a small announcement, or maybe a big announcement. It's some bit of news about whiskey on the West Coast. And we've been inspired by some people who've reached out to us to ask if we have a Patreon page, to go ahead and actually set up and start a Patreon membership page. If you're not familiar with Patreon, it's a subscription service where you can go ahead and support your favorite content creators by signing up for a membership at a few different costs. And there's different membership incentives that come with that. And so some of the things that we are putting together is basically exclusive content, exclusive videos that would be available to our Patreon subscribers. On top of that, there's access to direct messages. We'll be running some polls. There's a few other membership perks as well. There's 3 different tiers that we're going to have set up at the start, and we're going to look at more things that we can add as that grows. But it's a way that you can help support the channel financially, because we're realizing very quickly this is getting very expensive. And while I don't do it for money, if we're able to cover more costs, that means I'm able to source more whiskey to hopefully bring more reviews and more content to you guys. So if you're seeing this video, that means the Patreon page is live. And if it's live, that we're also making sure that there's videos already ready to go on that site, so that we're not trying to play catch up immediately. So some from Bladnoch that you will see on that Patreon page at the start are going to be reviews, basically first impression reviews of 4 different Bladnoch whiskeys that were in this tasting as well. And those include the Bladnoch 11-year-old, which is a really interesting, similar take on the 10-year-old. They're kind of, it's interesting that Bladnoch even released 11-year-old, but there's a different take because they use red wine casks as well as the ex-bourbon casks. There's Bladnoch Sam Syrah, which is a 10 to 14-year-old non-age statement Bladnoch. There's the Bladnoch 14-year-old Oloroso sherry cask, and there's a Bladnoch 19-year-old PX sherry cask. So a comparison of the 2 different types of sherry and how they get along with the Bladnoch spirit. So I'm hoping this is interesting to some of you, and if you like, just go ahead and check it out. There's also one of the tiers, which is just simply a buy me a dram, buy me a coffee, where you financially support the channel that way. Enough about that. Just, I'm really excited about this announcement, and in every place I can go ahead and share whiskey content and whiskey videos with you. If you're looking for the link, you can find that in the description below. Let's get to these 3 whiskeys. Okay, first up, we're gonna have a rather classic take, in my opinion, of Bladnoch Spirit. I say classic, I haven't had that much Bladnoch, but what I've read through different books and different reviews, this seems to be a more typical take on Bladnoch. And this is the Bladnoch 10-year-old. Again, it's 46.7%, which seems to be like kind of a signature percentage for them most of the time. They seem to go with that for their core range releases. It's non-chill filter, it's natural color, again, ex-bourbon, and on the nose immediately, it is sweet and cheesy. It's this cheesy, bit funky smell. And for me, as a good Canadian, instantly it made me think very vividly of sour cream glazed donuts from Tim Hortons. Every time I stick my nose in this, ever since I put that together, that is what I smell. Sour cream glazed donuts, which happens to be my favorite donut. Yeah, fun fact about me, I like sour cream glazed donuts. Also, really vivid white chocolate note. More white chocolate than fondant. Sometimes I kind of can get fondant and white chocolate in the same breath, but white chocolate, I would say. Yeah, and that cheesy, funky note, now that's been uncovered for a bit longer, is starting to blow off the nose a little bit, and it's more just classically malty and creamy, ex-bourbon style, vanilla. Still like a lemon cheesecake sort of thing though, with like a vanilla whipped topping on top. There's vibrant, fresh barley notes, honey, and if I'm looking for fruits in this, as I mentioned with like the lemon cheesecake, but there's also like some cantaloupe to the nose as well. Really exciting nose for me. I'm really enjoying this nose. Those who don't like a cheesy note, or even like something that's a touch more lactic, you might not like this. So beware in that case if you're looking to buy this bottle and you have some experience not liking something like Bruichladdich from Ex-Bourbon. Maybe you want to steer clear of this for that reason. On the palate, let's take a sip. Honey, graham cracker, malted barley, lemon citrus. Yeah, it's like graham cracker drizzled with honey. Some vanilla icing again on the finish right now, because that's what I'm experiencing right now. Again, classic malt finish, touch of that funk coming back right now too. And the oak is actually surprisingly present on the finish right now. Another sip. Very light toffee note, and or almost like a shortbread cookie in there too. But the cheesy notes actually are still there. They're present. Oh man, some spice too. Some spice from that American oak. It's light, but it's there. And then vanilla is turning up a bit now. But it's all very sweet confections and some cheesy notes. And then classic malt, honey, these sorts of bright, vibrant things. On the finish, I'm getting some more spice now. It's a spicy finish right in this moment. However, it's not peppery. It's not like a cracked black pepper. It's like a light baking spice. Something that's more dessert toned as opposed to something that's more savory. This bottle runs about $100 Canadian. If you can still find it. It's getting a little bit more scarce because I think people have kind of realized that this is a really quality offering from Bladnoch. And I think it's one of the best representations of the distillate character. I really like it. I think this really truly is worth every penny. It's not perfect, but it's fascinating and it's unique. And again, it's not something that's been covered over with its character. It's really great. If I had to score this, I'm looking more towards like 87.5 to 88, which is a really solid score. And for $100, I think it's great value. I would be picking this up if I find a bottle at $100 Canadian sometime soon. I'm keeping my eyes open. I've been looking at some websites, and if I find it in that price range, I'm gonna pick up a bottle of this because this is great. If I want a Bladnoch, this might be one of the ones that I want to keep on the shelf. All right, let's move on to the next whiskey. Next up is one of the more premium offerings from the Bladnoch distillery, and this is the Bladnoch Talia Rare Release. This is the 2022 edition. This comes in at 45.5% ABV, and it's a vintage release. Now, it is Oloroso sherry and California red wine casks once again, and it's speculated to be majority, if not entirely, 20-plus-year-old whiskey. So this would be whiskey that's entirely from before Raymond Armstrong took over. Now, why that's interesting is because, again, this is sort of like of another era, which reminds me of a whiskey I'm going to talk about a little bit later when I finish nosing this whiskey, because I think there's some commonalities. Now, this whiskey is on the premium side. It's not chill flavor, it's natural color, but it is $565 Canadian, so keep that in mind. And the quote that really caught my attention with this was that this combines whiskeys from the oldest casks in the Bladnoch archives. So this is some of the oldest whiskey in their warehouses because this is pre-closure distillate as far as I'm aware. Let's get to the nose, the palate, and the finish here and check out what we think of the Bladnoch Talia. Immediately, black currants, jam, fruit preserves. Yeah, like a raspberry jam, figs, like fig spread, and like a touch earthy Oloroso note. Perhaps a bit of like coffee cake too and fruit leather, but a really, really rich nose right off the bat. Something musty, like almost closer to like a dunnage note. Now it's been uncovered for a few moments, it's starting to become a bit more subtle. but there's still lots of complexity there. There is, here, let me coat my glass a little bit here. See if I can pull something else out of this. Yeah, that worked. Okay, there's a huge tobacco note here. Tobacco and orange marmalade, like really vibrantly, very orangey. Super orange citrus, but like mixed in with the tobacco. That's a really nice combination. Really like that. Milk chocolate too now. Wow. So that's like what? That's like a cigar and a Terry's chocolate orange. That's an interesting Christmas. Also get this really heavily steeped tea note that I get on a lot of older whiskeys that also have some cherry maturation with them. It's like a strong, really strong steeped orange pico. And if you're hearing that note and you've watched perhaps my 1,000 subscriber live stream back a little while ago, you'll know that I picked that note up on another distillery release from Bruichladdich. It was a Bruichladdich Black Art 7.1. That was probably my favorite note that I pulled off that nose. And it was a really strong nose. And that whiskey, of course, is also a whiskey made with pre-closure distillate from Bruichladdich. Really interesting commonality there, that this was a kind of secretive whiskey made with the oldest casks in the Bruichladdich archives, let's say. The rarest stuff in dwindling stock. And I'm pulling a similar nose off that in that regard, in those notes, as I am on this. So that's really interesting. I like that parallel there, especially with the parallels of the years that they were closed, same length of time, mid-90s, early 2000s. Yeah, I think that's really cool. Let's hurry up and take a sip of this whiskey. Orange spread, big oak spice, coffee. Like it's it's like coffee con leche. It's like coffee with milk. There's a big cherry note too, like Okanagan cherries. Milk chocolate now on the finish. Milk chocolate just coating my palate. It's really nice. And kind of like a earthy, musty dunnage tone now too. There's some real age on this whiskey is what I'm picking up. Take another sip here. Now the milk chocolate on the nose is turned a little bit more like bittersweet. The tobacco follows through off the nose into the palate, and there's some leather there too. This is a fantastic nose, a fantastic palate. Oh, the finish, like antique woods, like antique wooden furniture, like that sort of smell. Leather, chocolate, and the only fault I can find on this whiskey right now is that the finish is fading a little bit faster than I'd really love it to. I'd like it to kind of hold on just a little bit longer. But of course, that's an all too common knock with older whiskeys, especially when they get down towards this proof under the kind of like 48% range. I know I found on the Bruichladdich Black Art 7.1, I found the finish to be the weakest part of it. I think in this case with the Bladnoch Talia, also the finish is the weakest part of it. The nose is beautiful. It's a beautiful nose, great palate, and the finish is okay. It's okay. There's a lot of good flavors there. It's just they kind of lose their power. They lose their steam. Honestly, I really am enjoying this whiskey. And it's priced rather similarly to some of the Bruichladdich releases, like the Bruichladdich 8.1. It's not all that dissimilar in price. So they're also kind of along the same lines there. I wonder if this was actually thought up as basically Bladnoch's answer to the Bruichladdich Black Art. However, $565 Canadian is probably a bit too much for my liking. It's a great whiskey. I would probably score it like a strong 89, 89.5 out of 100. That's a really strong score. I don't love scoring on samples though. It's tough to get a really great read, and I should probably have a few more drams before I give it a score. So that's an entirely unofficial take on the score. If I found it on a good deal, I would absolutely look to buy this bottle. However, $5.65 is just a bit too rich for me. If you have a really strong curiosity in Bladnoch and you want to taste some older Bladnoch whiskey, this is a great way to do it. So this might be the whiskey for you. All right, let's get to something really unique, some peated Bladnoch. I want to thank you guys so much for watching this far into the video. If you haven't already, please like, share, subscribe, consider becoming a Patreon. That is weird for me to say, that feels peak YouTube, but I'm gonna keep going here. And typically right around here is when I'd ask you a question, because I really love having your guys' feedback. I try to answer every comment that's put on the videos. And I'd probably ask something along the lines of, if you've had Bladnoch whiskey, what's your favorite release from the Bladnoch distillery? But I think I'm just gonna do something a little more fun and say, we're coming up on October. There is a Friday the 13th in October. I believe there's 13 operating distilleries in Scotland, malt distilleries that start with the letter B. So what's your favorite distillery that starts with the letter B? We've been talking about B distilleries here, Bladnoch, Bruichladdich. Let's talk about some others like Ben Nevis, Ben Romick, Braval. Yeah, toss out what's your favorite whiskey distillery that starts with the letter B. Kind of silly, but let's do it. Last up in this very long video, thank you for holding on for this, guys, is a third different take on Bladnoch spirit. We had the old combination of sherry and ex-bourbon. We had the younger 10-year-old ex-bourbon, really clean look at the distillate. This here though is Bladnoch Alinta, and Bladnoch Alinta is funnily enough, it's 47% instead of the 46.7 that's so common with Bladnoch releases, but it is a non-chill filtered, natural color, PX sherry and ex-bourbon peated Bladnoch. You don't see much peated Bladnoch. This is actually my first peated Bladnoch I've ever had. Now this is made with whiskey from the new ownership regime. So when the Australians and Mr. Pryor took over, they started making their own spirit. They had control over the operation, and they brought on Nick Savage from Macallan. So this is, to my understanding, largely, if not entirely, whiskey that was distilled after 2015. So it's relatively young whiskey. This was a 2022 release, and as such, it couldn't be older than 7 years minimum. And the name Alinta, as far as I understand from the branding with this, it's an indigenous Australian word meaning fire or flame. So fire, flame, kind of goes with peated smoky whiskey. That makes sense to me. Let's dive in. Let's see what's on the nose here. Yeah, no, that's smoky, and that's a different type of smoke. This is not an Isla peat. This isn't even a Highland peat. This is its own sort of thing. It's a salty peat, but it's also really sweet. It's like sticky sweet. It's like buttermilk pancakes that have been like, there's some banana in there, so there's chopped banana on top of those pancakes. And instead of maple syrup, they're using like a really thick, like almost like molasses chewy, like high proof rum, like 75.5%, like 151 rum. And then they've gone and flambéed those buttermilk pancakes, and that's where the smoke is coming from the lighting the buttermilk pancakes and bananas and everything else on fire with that sweet rum. It's a bit of a ridiculous thing, but takeaway, like sweet maple syrup sort of thing, molasses. Again, there's like bready, yeasty sort of tones with savory baked goods, and then all that smoked. Yeah, it's sweet. It's kind of a herbal smoke, honestly. It's like they've smoked rosemary twigs or something. If you dig underneath the peat, there's like some tropical adjacent sort of fruits, like maybe going in the direction of pineapple. I think a common theme is always getting like a citrus note along the lines of like an orange. But with the saltiness of this is going to be salted caramel for me as well. And that's probably like the most solid note I can pull here. It's just as simple as salted caramel. Smoked salted caramel. Yeah, let's go with that. All right, let's take a sip. Okay, this is young and powerful peat, and it starts going in the direction of a lot of like cracked black pepper, and it almost feels like it's gonna overwhelm my palate just a little bit, and then it takes a sharp turn. It's perfectly okay. It doesn't overwhelm. Last moment, it starts going kind of like sweet hickory barbecue with the palate, so maybe that's the PX sherry working with that peat. Some smoked meats with like a maple glaze. I wouldn't say like maple glazed salmon because it doesn't have that seaside coastal thing going on for me, but more like barbecue chicken or steak. Steak's probably the right one, honestly. Another sip. I don't know what ppm, what phenol count this is. I'm imagining it's quite big because, and the peat smoke is quite pervasive. On the finish, it's like big, leathery peat smoke with a sweet edge. And honestly, there's even some like savory peppering too on the finish right now. That's more akin to like a kind of peppery steak rub. Yeah, that's kind of where I'm profiling there, and it's still, the smoke is still billowing right now on the retronasal and the after on the finish after the palate here. Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting take on Bladnoch. It's entirely unrecognizable, really, for me, between the 10-year-old to the Alinta. It's interesting, definitely interesting take on it. I just think there's too much lost with the peat. And speaking of being lost and peat, how does this stand out in a sea of peated whiskeys right now? It seems every region is trying their hand at peated whiskeys. Highlands, Lowlands, Islands, Isla, obviously. Campbelltown, Isla and Campbelltown, that's kind of their thing. And the islands have always dabbled with it. And historically, yes. Historically, almost every distillery would have had to use peat in order to dry their barley. I'm not sure if this is something I want a whole bottle of. I'm really happy to try it. I think I'd have it again because it is a really unique take on this. And if you wanted to have an example of each type of Bladnoch spirit, you'd probably want the peated whiskey in there too, so you could go and do this comparison with other peated distillate. However, at $130 Canadian, I'm not going to say it's not worth that. It's probably worth that amount. But am I going to reach for this over, say, Port Charlotte 10? And am I going to reach for this over, I mean, I think my last bottle of Lafroig 10 cask strength was about that price. Maybe just about $10 Canadian more, which isn't that much. I have a really hard time seeing myself buying an entire bottle of this unless it's on sale. If I had to give a score to this, it's probably in around like 84, 85, which again is a fine score, but don't put too much weight in that. Put more weight on the words that I've said in regards to this whiskey as opposed to a score, because again, this is just a first impression. Well, there you have it, guys. I have a clear two favorites here. I think I really love that 10-year-old and the value you find in that at $100, and being able to have something that really just sings to what I think is the distillate signature for Bladnoch, at least this iteration of Bladnoch. That Talia was beautiful, and I see some merits to the Alinta too. If you've had these, let me know what your thoughts are on them. Thank you once again for all your support, all your comments, all the suggestions for where this channel should go next. If you can, take a look at the Patreon if you're at all interested in that. Again, the link is in the description below. And join me again for more whiskey content on the YouTube channel here at Whiskey on the West Coast, from the West Coast. Slange.